And to do so, we are going to create a new folder in here, and I'm just going to call that utils. And inside this utils folder, I'm just going to create a db.javascript file. And this is just going to be a fake database of products. So we're going to have sunglasses and shoes, and I'm going to expose two functions in here. One is called list products. The other one is called purchase products, where I'm going to grab the ID of the product that I want to purchase, and then we're just going to reduce the in-stock value with the purchased quantity. Okay, so this is just acting as a fake database, as I said. Now we're going to create a page where we're going to be listing the products, but before we do that, I would actually like to expose this product information as an API endpoint. So Astro also supports API endpoints. So I'm going to go back to my source folder. Inside here, I'm going to create a new folder called API. And inside this API folder, I'm going to create a new file. I'm just going to call that product.json.js. And inside this file, we can now utilize export statements with the function names mapped to HTTP methods. So for example, I could say export async function get, for example, to make sure that the HTTP get method is going to be handled by the API endpoint that we have here. Also note that the extension of .js or .ts, if you're writing TypeScript, is going to be automatically removed during the build process. So inside here, what I would like to do is grab my products, which we can do by calling the list products function that we've just specified inside this quote-unquote fake database. And then this particular endpoint should return a new response, and there's just going to be a standard response API call and JSON.stringify, which is going to return the products themselves like this. Now, you have two options. If you have the static side generation mode, which we still do have that, it means that these custom endpoints, these custom API endpoints are going to be called at build time, and they're going to produce a list of static files. If we opt into the server-side rendering mode, then these custom endpoints will turn into live server endpoints, and they're going to be called on request. Okay, now in light of this, we are going to be switching to server-side mode, and then you will see how the behavior of Astro is just going to change. Now, the big question is, of course, how do you change to server-side rendering mode? What you need to do is go into the astro.config.mjs file, and where you see export default define config, you need to specify output to be server. And as you can see, the three options are hybrid, server, and static. So server means that you get this on-demand rendering, and then essentially you should use the server mode if you want server-side rendering enabled for most of your site. The hybrid mode is going to be using pre-rendering or pre-rendering your HTML by default, and you should use that option if most of your content is static. But we're just going to opt into server right now. Now, one thing that I would also like to mention is that if you have output set to be server mode, it means that you need to install and enable a so-called adapter, because if you have server mode, it means that you need to have a runtime. And luckily for us, Astro supports multiple adapters. They support Vercel, they support Netlify. Just make sure that you enable one of those. Now, for our development environment, we are going to be using the node adapter. So all I need to do is specify adapter, and then it's just going to be the node adapter, but we need to configure that as well, of course. So how can we configure that? Earlier during the workshop, I mentioned that Astro has a very robust CLI, which would allow us to modify this configuration file automatically. So let's just hit save here for output server. Let's quit the running process, and I'm just going to type in npx astro add and then node. Similarly, if I want to add the adapter for Vercel or for Netlify, I would say npx astro add and then Vercel, Netlify, or anything else. For a full list of potential adapters, please visit the appropriate documentation page on Astro, which I'm bringing up on my screen as well. So Cloudflare, Netlify, Node.js, and Vercel are the official adapters. All right, so this particular command wants us to continue. So let's say yes, it will install the dependencies, and it will also make this change inside our configuration file. So do you want to continue? Yes, let's go ahead and make this change. All right, so we have the Node.js adapter running, and we have the server output set as well. So now with this, we have effectively changed the default behavior of Astro. We have gone from static side generation mode to full-blown server-side rendering mode. Now I'm going to start up npm run dev again. The port is still there, so nothing changed. Let's go back to products.json. And let's see if we get some data back. So I like to use a REST API client within Visual Studio Code, but you can use Postman, Insomnia, whichever you want. I'm just going to be using Thunder client, and we're going to make a new HTTP GET request against localhost 4321/API/products.json. And we get a connection was refused by server. And unfortunately, I didn't realize, but the API folder should be within the pages folder. So apologies for that. Just make sure that you make this change as well. All right, now that we have the server mode running, let's open up the browser. And if we go to localhost 4321/API/products.json, notice that we have this live endpoint. We have our product data available right here. Okay, so this is quite amazing, but let's not stop here, and let's take a look at what happens if we now create a new page as well. So let's create a new page in this new server-side rendering mode, and let's call this products.astro, for example, making sure that we spell Astro correctly. And what I'm going to do here is make sure that first I make a fetch API request to grab all the product information. And I'm going to say something like const response is equal to await. Also notice that you can use top level await inside this top section in your .astro files. And I'm just going to make a fetch API request to /API/products.json. But what if I say deploy this site? I don't want to, hard code localhost 4321, or you could be on another port. How can you make sure that you get the site's URL dynamically all times? Remember that I mentioned that there is a built-in global Astro object. So we can just use that and say astro.url.origin, which will always give us the origin URL of the page, whether that's deployed or not. We just always get the right value here. And then we can do /API/products.json like so. And then we can essentially destructure products from response.json. And you know what's next, because now we have product available here. We can go and list the products right here. So let's create an unordered list, for example. And inside this unordered list, we can go ahead and iterate through all the products using a simple map. And for each product, we can just go ahead and render a list item where I'm going to print the name of the product, and we're going to say current stock, and we're just going to print product.in stock like so. All right, so this is a new page that we've added. So let's go ahead and visit /products in our application and great. We now have current stock of 12, current stock of 25. And remember, we are now using server-side rendering, which means that the stock values are updated real time. So let's actually check if this is in fact true. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to add the button here. And this button will have an ID of purchase. And I'm just going to give it a text purchase something. This is going to be just a very arbitrary way of purchasing a particular product. And with this, I would also like to show you something, because so far the JavaScript that we've written was something that got executed either at build time or at request time, but it was always server-side JavaScript. But what if you would like to execute JavaScript inside the browser itself? Well, it couldn't be easier. All you need to do is add a regular HTML script element on any of the pages where you would like to execute client-side JavaScript. And in here, you can now type in whatever JavaScript code you want. Now, in our case, what I'm going to do is call a particular endpoint to purchase a random product from our database. But in order to do that, I will also need to create another API endpoint that will allow me to actually make that purchase. But this time around, the API endpoint is going to be using the same sort of logic that we used for destination, because with this purchase, I would like to send an ID, or I would like to send the ID of the product that I would like to purchase, but currently we don't have an API endpoint to handle that. And of course, the ID itself is going to be a changeable parameter. So I will make sure that I create a new endpoint called id.json.js, where the ID is wrapped in square brackets. And inside this particular file, I'm going to write the logic to handle the product purchase. And just as a kind reminder, inside our database, we already have the purchase product function, which is going to deduce the quantity of the in-stock property for a given product. But now we need to make sure that we actually call that. All right, so this is going to be another get handler. So we're going to use the same logic that we've used here. So export async function get. So let me actually copy that straight away. And then we're going to write the get handler here. And first things first, we're going to grab the ID from somewhere. But the question is, how can we grab the ID? Well, luckily for us, the get function allows us to pass in params, which will allow us to then access params and then .id. Why ID? Well, because the name of the file and the changeable parameter that we have here in between the square brackets is ID. Okay, so now we have access to the ID. Then I'm going to specify something like a random quantity. This is just going to say math.floor, and let's just really pick a random number between, say, 3 and 1. And then we're going to get an updated product list, where we're going to call the purchase product from our database. We're going to pass an ID and random quantity. And then what we're going to return, very similarly to how we've done it here, which is going to return the updated list of products. So I'm going to say new response, and then instead of products, I'm just going to return the updated product list. All right, so now we have that new endpoint. We can now write the logic inside our client-side JavaScript in products.astro to actually go and make the purchase. So I'm going to grab the button by saying document.query selector, and then this one is called the purchase button. So I'm just using the same ID right here. And then I'm just going to add an event listener for the click event, which is going to be handled by this asynchronous event listener right here. And we're going to pick a random product again. And this random product is going to be having either an ID of 1 or 2. And then we are now going to call our endpoint that we've just created. Okay, so in this case, we can't really use the global Astro object, but we can still use location.origin, which is the JavaScript equivalent of getting the origin URL /API, and then which is going to make a call to random product.json, where random product is either going to be having a value of 1 or 2. And we just need to make sure that we do this inside the event listener like so. And then we're going to say await response.json. All right. So hopefully this is now going to work. So let's go full screen. Let me actually open up a new window as well, because I would like to show you what happens. So let's say I click on purchase something, maybe 3 times, 1, 2, and 3. And then let's say on the right hand side, someone just loads this page, and notice how the current stock immediately is now reflected. Whereas if I were to have the static site generation mode, the data still would not get updated. The reason for that, remember, is because now we are using server-side rendering mode, meaning that every time when we load the page, we basically get the latest information. Whereas if we do static site generation, we are going to be looking at data, how it was when we created a production build of the page. Now, one last thing that I would like to talk to you about, and that is the fact that, we just switched static site generation off and turned server-side rendering on. But for example, let's say index.astro and about.astro and also destination.astro, they don't really need server-side rendering. So is there anything that we can do to tell Astro that, hey, you should still use static site generation for these pages and only do server-side rendering for the pages called product.astro, because this is what really requires live data. And the good news is that we can do something about this. So for every single file where you would like to still do static site generation, you can do an export const pre-render and make that equal to true, like so. And this is going to tell Astro that, for example, this index file should be pre-rendered, i.e. it should do static site generation on it. And then we can do the same for the about page and for the destination page. And so now you have this wonderful setup where pages that are truly static will still remain static. Pages that are dynamic will actually use server-side rendering. Now, there's a lot more to unpack about Astro. And again, let me just reiterate that I would highly recommend that you take a look at their documentation, because their feature set is really, really amazing. For example, they support content collections where you can actually build your pages out of markdown files, for example. They also support view transitions. They support prefetches. In the latest version, they just launched a fully managed SQL database which works exclusively with Astro. That's also really, really amazing. They also have integrations to popular frameworks and popular tools. For example, you could integrate, say, Tailwind CSS very easily with Astro. But what does it really mean to have an integration with other UI frameworks? Well, Astro has this concept of islands or islands of interactivity. And you can think about any web page as having sections where you require interactivity. For example, you require JavaScript to be run, and parts where you just don't need any JavaScript because everything is just static HTML. Now you could take components from any other frameworks, for example, a React framework, and add that to Astro. And then you can specify how the component should load. And there are multiple ways that you can load components, especially if they are external to Astro, inside Astro itself. And these are called the client directives. And again, you can just look that up inside the documentation. It's called client directives. And you can take a look at these. There's client load, idle, visible, media, and client only. So for example, you could have a component that you would only like to load when the browser is idle, i.e. when the browser has finished loading most of the JavaScript and everything else, you can then load the JavaScript for your component. Client visible, that is one of my favorites. What if you have particular components on your page that are only visible in, say, when someone is visiting the website on a desktop mode? So therefore, when someone is viewing the same page on mobile, they don't even see the components while load the JavaScript required to interact with that component. And you can just use the client visible directive to make sure that the JavaScript only loads for the component when the component is actually visible inside the UI space. And actually, I'm sorry, this is using the intersection observer. The other one that I wanted to say about, the desktop and the mobile view is called the client media, right? So this is going to use media queries to determine if the JavaScript for a particular component should be loaded. So as I said, please go ahead and explore what Astro can offer. There's a lot of great stuff in here. I personally really like working with Astro. So take a look at all these features. And what we're going to do next is start looking at the CMS side of things. But before we do that, you can actually take a look at the documentation as well, because there is an entire section dedicated to Strapi and Astro. And in fact, we're going to be following some of these steps in here as well, but we're going to be modifying, of course, some of these built-in functions. Even though this is going to be a good start, it still will require us to do some modifications. Okay, so next up, we'll take a look at Strapi.